Hello everybody, James here. This is a tribute to Steve Mongo McMichael, who died at the age of 67, I believe, last night. As I record this, I'm not going to be talking about, obviously, his pro-American football career, because I'm just not the person, obviously, to talk about that. I'm going to talk a bit more about his pro-wrestling career, as you might imagine. But back when I was a kid, Mongo McMichael was sort of one of my guys. Not like a top star or anything like that, but he's somebody that you can't help but just look forward to seeing. Almost like a lot of people would say, like Steve Blackman or someone like that. He was just sort of like your guy, I guess. So, Steve McMichael, and I say I'm not going to talk about his American football career, but I'm going to briefly, I'm sure you all know, Super Bowl champion winner with the Chicago Bears in 1985. But when it came to retire from the NFL and finding something else to do, he fell into wrestling really quickly, as best I can tell, after an unhappy last season with the New England Patriots. But Steve was part of Lawrence Taylor's all-star team heading into WrestleMania 11, for those who remember that one, and it was Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow in the main event, and Bam Bam was flanked by Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation. So McMichael, I'm sure people wouldn't be surprised to learn, was of course pretty much like the first one, apart from LT, to get physical in the main event and elsewhere, I think on Raw maybe beforehand. And also McMichael was like the standout of the NFL All-Stars in that group at WrestleMania as well. You couldn't help but notice the guy. A few months later, Steve somehow ends up getting hired by Eric Bischoff. I think WrestleMania was like in late March, and then all of a sudden, September, Steve McMichael is commentating the debut episode of WCW NITRO, and he would be a commentator for like nearly a year afterwards as well. I think it's one of those things that people actually forget about Steve and the early days of Nitro as well. Eric Bischoff had no desire or designs on having Steve actually wrestle. He was sort of more going to be pretty much the Pat McAfee of his day, someone who'd come from the NFL, big name recognition, and a good personality to be one of the voices on this brand new show. The only thing that I unbelievably forgot is that he also used to bring a chihuahua with him to the broadcast booth every week and dress it up differently every single week. So if it's like Halloween, it'd be like like a vampire, I guess, or something. Anyway, on-screen Mongo would get into the ring teaming with another debuting NFL great in Kevin Green to take on Arn Anderson and Ric Flair, after Ric Flair was cracking on to Steve's real-life wife in the crowd, Deborah McMichael. And this was like June time, I think. I can't remember if it was Great American Bash. I forgot to write that down. But anyway, in 96, it was all a ruse, and then Mongo was presented by Deborah, in fact, a suitcase full of cash and a Four Horsemen t-shirt, and she was walking to the ring flanked by Woman and Miss Elizabeth, who were of course associated at the time with the Four Horsemen. And then it took Mongo all of about half a second to decide to join the Four Horsemen, and he clonked Kevin Green on the head with said suitcase. And then he would actually carry a suitcase with him for a lot of his run in WCW as well, that he would really smash people in the head with, and he'd get hit as well, so he wasn't afraid to take a hit. Steve ended up being a member of the Four Horsemen, unsurprisingly, and when all is said and done, I think a pretty good one. And I don't think when you think of like the better Four Horsemen members, you think of Steve McMichael, but I think people should, and I'll explain why. It's like Paul Roman was obviously the worst, but let's get it right. I know this is a tribute to Steve. He was a horrible wrestler, honestly, but horrible in a good way somehow. He was really charming with how bad he was wrestling. Steve was actually fast-tracked into the ring and onto television as a wrestler. And basically, he didn't have very much time to train, like weeks probably. He had very little coordination. He messed up constantly. He fell through the ropes. He couldn't do half the moves without falling over or messing them up or like doing in like stages of 10 or whatever. But he had great enthusiasm. He had great strength. He was deceptively big. He was almost like Randy Orton. You get him in there with most people and you sort of realise just how big a dude he was. I think he was like, when a lot of people claim 6'4" or 6'5", he really was 6'4", 6'5", or whatever, or 6'6", whatever he was. And the other thing is that he was massively charismatic, so he was like 80% of the way to being a great wrestler right there. It also helped that he could party like a Four Horsemen member, according to the likes of Kurt Hennig and others. He'd basically be the one to close the bars down. And other things that basically what Mongo lacked in ring, he made up for in charisma and personality. The same actually went for Kevin Green as well at that time, because he was hugely enthusiastic and he was really good for his level of training, which was like practically nothing. But the problem with Kevin Green was that he was still an active player, and he would only turn up here, there, and everywhere briefly before he'd obviously, have to go back. And just in the researching of this, I already knew this, but it's sort of stunning that Kevin Green died a few years ago as well, in 2020, and heart attack, which is just pretty, stunning, I guess. Steve McMichael would gradually improve in the ring, and he really would across 1997. And he was way more often than not sort of placed in tag team matches. So, he'd usually be with a Flair or an Arn Anderson to guide him, probably to call spots for him, tell him what to do. And he would get better and basically learn on the job. But make no mistake about it, he was always a total stiff. He didn't have like any flexibility and that kind of thing. I think he used to take a lot of bumps. Like when Batista was pushed by, what was it, Mark Henry, and he sort of like took 2 steps and went, ugh. He was sort of that kind of thing, but once again, he was an enormously charming performer. So Mongo then feuded with Jeff Jarrett after Deborah started managing Jeff Jarrett instead. So if you were a fan of WWF only during the Attitude Era and you wondered what the connection was between Jeff and Deborah, that's the connection. And Jeff would even lose the US title to Mongo, so that was, no small achievement, especially back in the day. When Jeff jumped to the WWF in late 1997, Deborah briefly managed Alex Wright instead, and they feuded. And then by that time, it was sort of for the career of the wrestling career, at least for Steve, it was sort of the beginning of the end. So by the beginning of 1998, Deborah was gone from WCW because they were going through a real-life divorce, and I guess they just didn't want to pay Deborah anymore, I suppose. And with the Four Horsemen dissolving a few months earlier, Mongo really didn't have anywhere to go but down because, Steve's in-ring work regressed to the point that he didn't have like Arn Anderson or Flair or whoever, or, Benoit, whoever else he was working with to guide him to basically make him better. So ended up in 98, Steve was by far the worst wrestler in WCW, and there's some bouts with the British Bulldog that are almost unfathomably bad around that time, including ones on pay-per-view. But anyway, this is a tribute to Steve. I don't want to be talking about all this bad wrestling, though. We're talking about all the good stuff here. So toward the end of 1998, Steve and the rest of the Four Horsemen reformed when Ric Flair offered, he was suing WCW at the time, I'm sure you know. He took a day off to watch his kid watch Reed wrestle, in fact amateur wrestle, and Eric Bischoff suspended him or tried to fire him, and then there was like months where they were at odds. But essentially, I think I don't know if it was August, September, I'd say September, they reformed of 1998. But then it was almost like a can't miss prospect, and then all of a sudden the Four Horsemen, instead of feuding with the NWO, the other members of the NWO, Benoit, Dean Malenko at the time, and especially Mongo, were all relegated to afterthoughts while Ric Flair and Eric Bischoff feuded. And then McMichael's last televised match was a no contest, tagging with one of his real life best friends for decades, Ric Flair, against Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in February of 1999. I think it went over 10 minutes. It ended up in a no contest, no less. He wrestled at least one more match in the March of 1999, and that was it as far as Steve was concerned as an active wrestler. But Steve McMichael would make one more major wrestling-related appearance in TNA, of all places, for their 2008 Bound for Glory pay-per-view, where the guest refereeing Mongo, how he did it was so sluggish and so slow. It just and it was a monster's ball match, and I think it's like 8 people in the match or something like that, and he was counting so slow but somehow the Wikipedia entry is even more famous than his performance in that match, which says McMichael refereed the monster's ball match. The match was notable for McMichael's extremely slow cadence for a 3 count, and I think they nailed it there. In 2021, Steve McMichael announced, after living in denial somewhat, quite frankly, about the symptoms he was suffering, he believed the tingling in his arms were to be like neck or spinal issues, and not what it ended up being diagnosed as. And bear with me, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, more commonly known as ALS, or even Lou Gehrig's disease, after the famous American baseball player who suffered it in the earlier stages of the 20th century. I'll say that, I think the 30s or 40s, I guess. So people, just in case they don't know, ALS symptoms, and I'm reading this from a medical textbook or a medical website. Symptoms typically involve progressive muscle weakness, atrophy, starting in the limbs or speech and swallowing muscles, and then early symptoms can include muscle twitching, cramps, and difficulty with fine motor tasks like buttoning clothes or writing. As the disease progresses, it can lead to difficulty walking, speaking, swallowing, and breathing, and it is a horrifically cruel, drawn-out disease of which there is currently no known cure. So one of the final things that Steve McMichael reportedly spoke of was his desire to be inducted in the NFL Hall of Fame. And after years of campaigning, Steve got his wish in 2024, where he was presented with a bust of his own head, and he was surrounded by family and friends at his bedside. He had only just been moved into hospice care. I think it was announced like a day before news announced his death, which was reported on April 24, 2025. Steve Mongo McMichael was 67 years old. So rest in peace to Steve McMichael. Is somebody that I really enjoyed watching with the Four Horsemen, and one of the better members, I think, when everybody looks back on that group and when it's all said and done. So once again, rest in peace, Steve Mongo McMichael.